Hey everyone, welcome to an all new episode of A Storyteller's Power Hour. Tonight, I am going to talk about a couple of things. We're specifically going to start talking a little bit. Sorry, the hobbits are calling. We're going to talk a little bit about where 2023 is in terms of storytelling. I want to address a couple of things that are on my mind about what I've been seeing lately. And this is going to diverge a little bit from media, like TV series, scripts, and movies, and also some, I think, interesting conversations about the literature behind some of what I'm seeing. I'm going to start by saying that this year has been one of the most progressive years that I've seen in terms of inclusive storytelling. That is, we've seen a lot of other kinds of representation than we are used to seeing, which is great because the more we expand the idea of storytelling to be inclusive, the more, and I should say the richer we are for that experience. Now, a couple of things about that, which I am also on the one side really excited about, but on the other side, I'm a little bit disturbed by. Um, we are experiencing a lot of, I guess I would call it kind of, you know, not nefarious, but misguided cultural appropriation. And by that, I mean, it is really never okay to take another person's culture and write from from the standpoint of being an expert about it unless you actually are an expert about it. Now, the storytelling itself can run the gamut. I think maybe one of my favorite sort of ideas that go around this is Neil Gaiman, because Neil Gaiman, when he writes in American Gods and when he wrote the Anansi Boys, there is so much richness to the cultural aspects that he brings to the table and formulates them all into a very genetically modified story. It's absolutely beautiful. But I think we have to be careful that we aren't sort of tipping over into, okay, well, I heard this story, and let's say it's a South African story, and then we make it our own. I'm not saying that we can't have those as our base points, but I do think that we need to be a little bit sensitive to the fact that this information is sometimes culturally coded in a way that we may not understand. And so just taking it and running with it can lead to, I think, well, perhaps not with malintent, it can lead to a lot of very frustrated sort of readers who may understand something different than what they're actually than what your intent was. And I realize that that's a little bit convoluted, but I've seen it on a number of occasions, and it's a little bit frustrating for me even, and I don't have any skin in that game at all. The other thing that I'm seeing a lot of this year is, and this is nothing new. We've had 2 decades of the reboot, rebrand, retelling, the endless sequels. You know, for a long time, I was really, really upset with that. And I felt like, well, what are we doing? I mean, why can't we get new material in the mix? Why can't we create something that is fantastical but runs on completely different levels? And it's a little bit short-sighted. There's lots of capitalist reasons for it. We have tons of input from studios and people not willing to take risks in terms of who the producers are, what they want in the bank as sureties. So we get through all that. But then we get to the point where we have recycled content to the point that the content itself no longer has value. And I sometimes think about this like, I think there is a good purpose behind recycling things, absolutely. And the sequels and prequels we can do, but we have to be careful about overdoing them to the point where it becomes unrecognizable. Now, having said that, there's been some amazing 2022 through 2023 has given us an amazing array of new storytelling. And I'll preface this by saying it's new storytelling in the guise of the sequel or a continuing story. And one of the biggest that I thought was really effective, and then I'll tell you about some stuff that's coming up, was Child's Play. Now, I know that Child's Play is not exactly everybody's cup of tea, but from a storytelling standpoint, they really took a kind of odd idea, um, and they branched out into several different, boy, what is a good word for this? They created a different kind of storytelling methodology to reinvigorate the Child's Play franchise. Now, the Child's Play franchise was already known for being inclusive. There's all kinds of different ideas put forth in Child's Play, which are actually really progressive. They're kind of good. But there's also, I think, one of the biggest issues that I've always had with Child's Play is it was always kind of boring. There wasn't very much to it. It felt very sort of unassuming, but then also very um, I don't know, boring. I guess is the best way I can say it. And eventually, it just kind of makes you not want to watch. But this year or last year, Child's Play got its own TV series, and honestly, there's something about the love that was put into Child's Play, which is, I think, personally, it shines. It just shines. It's what makes the show work. But above that, Child's Play as a series veers off into several different directions that I just never thought that the movies would ever veer off into. And it made it really interesting. It's, it is what it is. It's Child's Play. It's not, we're not looking at the kind of qualitative storytelling that is going to suddenly make people openly weep or, come to some epiphanies. But there are plenty of Tiffany's. I liked it. I really did like it. I liked it for its inventiveness. I liked it for its ingenuity. I liked the freshness of taking something that we've done a million times and giving it new life. Now, having said that, we also have had over the past couple of years many different Star Trek reboots, and reboots that are sort of new takes on older material. And of course, that always makes me so both uncomfortable and excited to see. And just from a timely standpoint, Strange New Worlds has, I think, really gone so far out of its way, especially this season with only 4 episodes in, to show us its quality, to show us that Star Trek is still a very viable franchise when done right. I had a lot of problems with the last season of Picard, and don't I please don't be offended if I say this. I know a lot of people loved Picard, but the storytelling felt old. It didn't feel as if there was anything new sort of to tell. It didn't grab me as, okay, as pioneers of science fiction, here's what we're going to tackle. We're going to tackle these really hard hitting questions. Now, don't get me wrong, they did ask hard hitting questions, but they were no different than any other drama that I might have seen. I really expect a lot of the Star Trek franchise with its science fiction genre intact. And Strange New Worlds gives me amazingly everything that I was looking for. Honestly, if you've heard me talk about some other shows like The Orville, you'll know that I'm a huge fan of representation in science fiction, because science fiction is almost made for that, right? Different worlds, different culture types, aliens that, don't fit in with the humanoid type, othering in, ways that we can't even imagine. And then what are the biological and morality questions that go along with that? These questions are the kinds of questions that to me are best served in science fiction models. I absolutely love them. So I'm really excited to see that season, this season for Strange New Worlds, and last season, and also some other. There's Lower Decks, which is an animated version, which I absolutely love. Um, there's a couple of other um there's a couple of other sort of intermittent Star Trek things that have been happening, which I'm also absolutely in love with. But one of the biggest things that I've seen recently is, let's not forget that Star Trek as a franchise has been sort of like a staple. Each generation kind of gets its own Star Trek method for storytelling, and it's you have factions of people that are, no, I'm only TOS, no, I'm only, or the original series, or no, I'm only Voyager, no, I love Janeway, no, I hate Janeway, I love Picard. No, I hate Picard. Things like that. The only series that I didn't really like out of the entire Star Trek franchise was Enterprise, and I feel so bad that I didn't. I wanted to love it, and I just couldn't. I don't know what was going on there, but we'll get into that another day. In the meantime, though, I will say that it's kind of exciting to see this brand of storytelling, despite the fact that it is franchise history long, continue to be fresh, and that there are still new things to tell, or things to tell which perhaps we have seen before, but we get a new glance at them. We see them from a different angle. We're watching them happen in a totally different framework. And I am reminded many times of my love for the King Arthur story, where we continue to tell Arthurian stories. We tell the King Arthur story over and over and over again, and our literature has literally 100 metaphors for what a King Arthur story is. But despite the fact that we've told it many, many, many times, we frame it with different circumstances. The rise of the king is always in a different place, a different time, a different idea. The knights have different points of valor, depending upon what is important at the time. And what I see in serial storytelling right now is a lot of that. A lot of us retelling our favorite stories over and over again via franchise, via, okay, here's what we've got in serial storytelling, but we're reframing it. We're reframing it with slightly more progressive bents. We're reframing it with sort of like what we see as our cultural ills or our cultural strengths. And I really, really like that. I feel like that is something to champion. Um, there's one of the big, I was hoping that my producer Josh was going to be available to talk about this, but one of the things that I am seeing in movies over the past, 2022 to 2023 is we have a strong need for our nostalgia. And feeling as if we want to be connected to stories is nothing new. It's one of the reasons that we do keep retelling stories again and again and again. But something interesting happens when we romanticize our nostalgia to the point that it then becomes, I think, obnoxious, for lack of a better word. Um, and we will sort of punish the story for our own inability to move on. And I'll explain what that means in just a second. There is an idea here that when we have nostalgia as a part of our recognition in storytelling, we have this connection to the story. We want it to be told in a way that resonates with us, but clearly we can't just keep retelling the same story again and again, because what would be the point? So we change little things, or we create an adaptation of the original story and we kind of, give it a new flair, give it a new kick, create something interesting around what was the old nostalgia. Now, what happens oftentimes is there are people out there who, I'll just say that they can be a little bit more purist than perhaps is healthy for the relationship that they should be having with the story. And so they can't really enjoy it because they're looking for that feel good nostalgia. Honestly, though, and I say this with the best of, I do think that there are good things coming down the road, but I do also think that we have to sort of let go a little bit of our idea that we are entitled to the nostalgia of our connection to a story, and that there can never be another story like that told. Um, I think it does a great disservice both to ourselves, but also to future generations. Um, Kids right now who don't know the indie story, or who've only heard of it, right? Haven't really, maybe they've only seen Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom. Maybe they only saw The Last Crusade. I don't know. But maybe they haven't even seen any. Maybe they just know Indiana Jones as a character. If older generations really pan a movie for not being what they want it to be, instead of just allowing the story to be told for whatever the story is worth, we do a disservice to that younger generation, because their storytelling should not be dependent upon our link to nostalgia. Now, it's a complicated line, and I'll admit that right off the bat. It's not like there are any bright demarcation lines where we can say, okay, well, here's where this is, and then here's where this is. And our movies should only represent this or only be this or whatever. But if we use the Indiana Jones story as kind of an example, there's an aspect of the storytelling that calls back to old Indiana Jones. But then there's a current model that's being put forth in that story that has a fresh take. And I haven't seen very many people at all give critiques that lend themselves to, well, there are new things to be discovered in the Indiana Jones movie. Um, because most of what I see are people complaining that it isn't what was the Indiana Jones series. And, again, I go back to the Star Trek and to the Child's Play, and I have to caution everyone, you're ultimately the only people that miss out on a good story are the people that don't enjoy it. And if you can sort of let yourself experience the good aspects of storytelling, you can admit that you don't like this aspect or that aspect. You don't like the fact that it doesn't make you feel as nostalgic as you want to. That's okay. But the storytelling should be open and experienced in a way that is free from other expectations. And I realize that that is very, very, very difficult. I got really concerned when I started to read more about the Alien franchise, which we know is getting an FX series later, I believe, this year. Um, and and I'm going to circle back to that because the idea that at this point, Wheel of Time and Lord of the Rings have now had a chance to show their quality, give us some, you know, definitive storytelling, um, and and now these pieces are actually based on literature, so if you're going to feel something about it, you've probably read it. But for Lord of the Rings, if you've seen movies, you may not have read the books, and you may erroneously think that things are out of universe or wrong. Um, and of course, then there's always the purists. There were purists in Wheel of Time too, which is the Amazon series, and that is getting its second season released in September, I believe. And I'm finding more and more as I'm looking at critic scores. It's something interesting. I've taken on sort of a pet project, if you will, of looking at critic scores and really reading reviews. And oftentimes there are exceptions. So please, don't at me about this. But by and large, the critics that I'm reading give very thin justifications for bad and good recommendations. So when they score a movie and they say, well, okay, I'm going to give this movie, 60%. The justification for why they give it 60% does not fall within any what I can see. It doesn't fall within any justification. It just is a feeling, or oh, they overused this trope, or hey, this was an interesting little side note that they put in there's nothing in the reviews that kind of give you the gut sense of what the movie is or isn't, and what the quality then matters. And the more that I look at these reviews, the more I understand that this is sort of the conversation at large in society. And it's important that I point this out because storytelling and our conversations about storytelling have to fall within some kind of parameter that gives us basic metrics for understanding what each other is saying. And if what we do is just say, well, I didn't like it, and there was this scene that just didn't make any sense, but we don't overall quantify what's happening, then we're doing a disservice to the people who check in and say, well, it only got a 15% on Rotten Tomatoes. I don't think I'm going to watch it. I do another podcast called 10 to 1. And one of our projects was to look at movies that the critics hated, but audiences loved. And there's more of them than you might think. Um, in fact, there's so many audience scores on Rotten Tomatoes that just go through the roof, but critics hated it. And again, if you look at what they say, there really isn't a good justification for the reasons that they don't like it. They just simply don't think it's worthwhile. I mean, there are few and far between the critics who will actually tell you, hey, I didn't like it because, in the first act, this happened. And it felt incredibly clumsy and slow. By the time that the climax of the movie happens, I was already checked out of a second subplot and didn't get any answers. Now, I'm not saying that every person is going to be able to give that, but something in that range would be really nice. If you're a critic and you are concerned about the quality of movies that are coming out, I really feel like you have to use a better words to describe what is happening and why it's not working. Um, One big thing that I continue to see, and I'm going to circle back to my Lord of the Rings and my Wheel of Time in just a second. But one of the big things that I keep seeing is that fandoms rush in to take over a space. And it can work either in the positive or in the negative. In the case of Transformers, Rise of the Beasts, the audience at large loved that movie. Absolutely loved it. And why did they love it? Because it was absolutely a throwback to an older time in the Transformers universe. Um, when storytelling was a little bit more simplistic, but it had a lot of punch, and it wasn't really complicated, but that's sort of what makes the Transformers universe work. So if you're a critic and you're coming in cold and you don't really know a lot about the Transformers universe, but you are looking at it from a movie perspective, hey, did this work? Of course you're not going to see what a fan sees. That's just a given. But I do also see the exact reverse, like with the Rings of Power, where we have audiences that rushed in to give really bad scores, really bad reviews of Rings of Power without giving any justification about why they didn't like it. Or when they did give justifications, those justifications were basically based on another person's work. They were not even based on Tolkien's work, they were based on Peter Jackson's adaptation of Tolkien's work. And so we're sort of comparing things a little bit erroneously, but more than that, where criticism is important and where it is and it should be given its due, right? We want to see that. We want to see that we can talk about shows, we can talk about movies, we can talk about books with critical thinking, with a kind of critic's with a critic's mind. You can say that you don't like the storytelling in this. There are plenty of books that I pick up and I don't like the writing. The story is great. I mean, it's a fabulous story, but the writing just absolutely turns me off. And then there are books that I read where I think, oh my gosh, this person is an absolute wordsmithing genius, but I cannot stand the story. It does not keep me interested. It makes me feel as if I'm going to fall asleep. And oftentimes I don't finish those books and it makes me really sad. And so those things are things that we can generally, we can critique those and say, this is why. But when we use sort of the critic score, the critic understanding of content and story, and especially recently, we could really turn off an entire group of people to really valuable content. Sort of, and again, I go back to the alien thing. Let's pick up on that thread again. I'm concerned. I'm concerned because I love the Alien franchise. I'm a huge horror fan. I've always been a huge horror fan. The Alien franchise is one of those franchises that really makes me happy. And I'm very concerned when I see people already in advance of any content, just little drips and drabs about what might be happening, what basic premise we may know is going to happen, and people already panning the entire idea, people already saying it's not going to be worth watching because it'll never be Alien. And I don't really know how you can say that. I felt very similar when Ridley Scott took the reins back up again and did Promethean, and people didn't like it because it wasn't Alien. But of course it wasn't Alien because it was an origin story. And the idea that we are so mired in our understanding of this is the only way to look at it, this is the only way to see the fandom, this is the only way that we're able to parse the information, again going back to nostalgia, is really short-sighted in a lot of ways. It is totally okay for us to say, I hate the dialogue, it's so tropey, there is this happening, there's that happening, I didn't like that. But it is at which none of those controversies or criticisms can be leveled at Promethean, by the way. The dialogue is great in Promethean. The storytelling is hard, but it's hard for a reason. It's hard because the alien origin story is supposed to be hard. It's not just about the xenomorphs. And that is always sort of discouraging to me, because when you can't see past just the main topic and you're not looking at what might be presented to you on a bigger level, I feel like we just really miss out. The other thing that I think we miss out on is real science fiction, which is why I brought up Star Trek, seeks to create for us a real series of perils that we need to understand our way out of. Thinking with philosophy, thinking with critical thinking, thinking with science, thinking with all the tools that are available to us in a way that gives us more depth, that allows us to see the world in a way that is totally different from the way that we see it now, because we're going to be presented with these issues. And the idea that our creators may have been an alien race is not even that far from what I think we genuinely believe anyway. We just frame it differently with different myth and different monotheistic or polytheistic bents. We're sometimes we get so stuck in the telling of a story as if it can only be told one way, and we forget to look at the many layers of the story. So the, like I said, Alien sort of gives me a little bit of pause because I don't like what I'm hearing, and what I don't like is that people have already made snap judgments about whether it's going to be good or bad when we haven't even seen any content. um Now, let's jump over to Rings of Power, and then I'll skip over to Wheel of Time. Rings of Power, as a serial storytelling format, it had limitations. It's gonna have limitations going forward, and I don't think that the addition to the Tolkien world here is really something that we can look at and go, well, that's not Tolkien. Of course, it's not Tolkien. It's based on Tolkien. It's just an adaptation of Tolkien storytelling. Now, there is, I think, a layer here, or a bar, I should say, with it, a threshold that should be met, because his storytelling, Tolkien's storytelling, is very clear. There are principles and ideas put forth by J.R.R. Tolkien which absolutely have to be included. And there are some things that would never be a part of a Tolkien story. And so we don't want those things to be automatically assumed that, oh, yeah, this is what Tolkien would have liked, because I don't think Tolkien would have liked any of this. But that doesn't mean that we can't enjoy the storytelling of it. If, we are many years removed from the original publishing of The Lord of the Rings, and um, even Christopher Tolkien's amazing in-depth work with Unfinished Tales and Histories of Middle Earth. We have to sort of take a deep breath and let go of some of our ideas so that new ideas can take hold and permeate, and so that we can enjoy just the stories in general. And I have a lot more to say about that, and maybe on a future podcast I will, but I want to get over to Wheel of Time. Wheel of Time, um, written by Robert Jordan, is an unbelievable series of books. It's one of the longest series of really excellent fantasy sci-fi lore that I can think of. Robert Jordan was not just an incredible writer, but also a kind of visionary thinker that mixed all kinds of theologies, philosophies, and ways of thinking into his books. Um, Good guys are not always just good guys. There are very few real white knights, real paladins in Jordan's world. There's always ambiguity. There's always gray lines that are continually cropping up and being presented. And I feel like that's right because people are that way as well. We are not just one aspect. We're not just all good or all bad. We're many shades of gray in between. And there's I don't mean to say like, some of us are, you know, criminals or no, I'm not saying it that way. I'm just saying that like we don't all exhibit the perfection that sometimes we write into our literature as that this is a good guy and oh wait that this is a villain. There's a lot of pieces in between that sort of make up that gray area, and I really like that. So, Wheel of Time in its first season, and this is why I bring this up. Wheel of Time in its first season, as an adaptation, did a really good job of changing the story so that we could understand, jumping right into it, that this world is unique and that we need to pay attention to certain place marks. There are ideas here that you need to put a pin in this. You need to save this idea for later. And in the first season of Wheel of Time, they did a really good job of making sure that we were aware of several different concepts, which will become incredibly important later. Now, my one big level criticism that I would give Wheel of Time as a series is that it felt rushed. It didn't stand up quality wise. And a lot of that had to do with the CGI, but some of it had to do with the the less than perfect presentation of special effects, not just the deeper CGI, but the sort of conceptual ideas. They didn't feel well thought out. I will give it one thing: the magic, because it is basically weaving, that was done brilliantly. I absolutely loved it. Say what you want about World of Warcraft as a movie, but there's another example of where they did the magic exactly right. They fixed it in a way that gave you the visual representation of magic in sort of the most perfect way for that world. And Wheel of Time does something very similar. The world dictates how the magic works, and the magic as it's presented to us needs to have certain safeguards. Safeguards isn't the right word. Needs to have certain protocols attached to it, and we can see those pretty clearly. Okay, season 2 of Wheel of Time is coming up, and my understanding is they took a long time with season 2 because they wanted to fix the wrongs of a rushed season 1. And I hope that that's true because Robert Jordan's series deserves all the accolades that it gets, and it deserves to be presented, I think, in a way that is careful and meticulous. So, from a technical standpoint, I hope that that's true. Story wise, we have a lot to grapple with in season 2 of Wheel of Time if they're going to keep to sort of our book content. There's a lot that will happen, and a lot of questions about morality and senses of justice. And this is one of the things that I think high fantasy, as an offshoot of science fiction, does really well. It gives us all kinds of opportunities to ask questions about who are we as a people? What is humanity? Can you help me define that? And I have high hopes. I do, but I also feel as if there are a group of fans out there, well, I'll put fans in quotations, that haven't even given Wheel of Time a proper chance. And once again, I will say There is a link, I think, that we all have to the way that we feel when we read or when we know a story and then we see or hear someone else present it to us. We have to take a step back and realize that both storytellers and audiences are different. So we may temper storytelling based on audience reactions, or we may look at a story being told by a brand new storyteller as the audience as you're not the same storyteller as the old storyteller. We want the old story. And it sort of does, again, a disingenuous service to the story. We should all be striving to embrace are adaptations for simply being adaptations. It doesn't mean you have to love the story. It just means that if it's an adaptation, it's an adaptation. You go in with that idea. Um, I started this whole conversation with where trends are in storytelling. And the reason that I sort of veered off into some of these other ideas honestly had to do with my viewing of The Witcher season 3. Um, I see, I'm getting tongue tied because I have this level of emotion for this particular story that runs really deep. I loved the entire series and and the book series. And I recognized very quickly with season 1 that this was a loose retelling, right? I mean, yes, they can say that they're sticking to some of the lore and they've got principles that they're going by, but I mean, the magic system is not the same. They and when I say that, I mean like it's very clear that what they're using as chaos is not that's not the formalized imagining of that magic system. Um, and there isn't, I don't think, there's not a lot of serious politicking in the way that I was expecting. And I thought that season 3 would bring that together. And it still doesn't. I mean, there is politicking happening, but it is loosely and largely sort of all around a high fantasy soap opera. Um, and that has its place and it has, I think, interesting merits all by itself. It just wasn't what I was expecting. And I had to really take a huge step back and think more carefully about the idea at large of what is it that I'm expecting from my stories and what is it that I can enjoy. And can I find something that I enjoy out of what is being presented? And what can I find to critique without sort of getting into, well, I just didn't like it, like what actually is there? As a former film student, I, I I'm sometimes very critical of the technical process that I see presented. I'm not a huge fan of trick storytelling. I'm not a huge fan of trick ideas when it comes to like using camera angles to make me think this or this when actually that isn't what's happening. um I mean, the master of using camera angles and lighting as another kind of idea is Hitchcock. Um, and his storytelling was absolutely dependent upon getting the right camera angles, getting the right lighting. It was part of the story itself. When I was watching Witcher season 3, I was struck by the idea that there were 0 lighting challenges, meaning like it didn't challenge my understanding of the world through lighting. That was one. And that really bothered me. There's so many opportunities for that to happen. And I'm not the director. I didn't write this. Um, I'm sure that they have an overall vision. But this is the kind of thing that I was thinking about in terms of critique, and this is the kind of thing that I really wish that other people would critique about where storytelling is in the moment. We're losing the ability to tell story through interesting interpretations of the visual narrative. We're so concerned with the action on screen that we have forgotten that all the technical things that go on around it also add to our complete understanding of what's happening in a scene. So that would be lighting, that would be camera angles, that would be um maybe color choices and palettes, it would be props. And one of the things in Wheel of Time that I love is that their props are absolutely, you can tell that they are shout outs to things that have happened in the book series, which maybe they'll never touch on, but it's like, well, hey fans, here's a little something something for you. I very much appreciate that. It makes me feel very seen as a reader. I loved it. With Witcher, and I will say also, I'm going to talk about Star Trek. I'm going to go back to Star Trek in a second too. But with Witcher, I'm missing all of that. I'm missing all the things that I feel like should be seen in a way that would make this high fantasy world come to life. And I'm thinking that the only important thing is just the straight progressive narrative. And I don't understand that because the Witcher world is completely nuanced with 100 different levels, all of the different cultures, all the different societal rules, all the different pieces that come together. They're missing here. We're not getting any of them. And once again, I didn't choose, nor would I choose, the narrative path that they're on, but I see it for what it is. And like I said, I had to take a gigantic step back from my own criticism and my own sort of like disdain for the series and rethink it and look at it with fresh eyes and realize, okay, I didn't like these technical things, but where in the story is there something for me not to like? That's a lot more subjective. And if I just watched it with sort of those fresh eyes, I was able to enjoy the fact that, hey, this is the Ciri, Geralt, Yennefer story of, found family coming together during times of adversity, understanding who your friends are, and being able to experience the world in a very complex time. I mean, there was plenty to like, I guess, is what I'm saying, but I had to stop sort of practicing my own hate of things exactly the way that I just said I think that fans do with other series, because I didn't even realize that I was doing it myself. So I'm going to go back to Star Trek. I felt this way about Star Trek originally when I started watching the first season of Strange New Worlds. I was like, oh no, what are they doing? Everything's so different. Why is Spock this way? What is this crazy Nurse Chapel thing? Like, what's happening here? And honestly, by about mid-season, I began to realize that my criticism was just my own inner preference for a Star Trek story that I hadn't gotten yet, and that didn't sort of line up with my own expectations because of what I had seen in the past. But then the sort of, the mid-season and beyond went above and beyond my expectations. And then in this second season, this has been truly astounding. The fourth in the series is a bit more of a standard Star Trek episode. There is a planet. It's Rigel 7, or is it Rigel 4? I can't remember. But there's Rigel, which is a shout out to an old episode of Star Trek during the Menagerie when we see, what Pike was thinking about, and what mistakes he had made and things like that. And so we kind of get to see a little bit of those things. It's weird they retcon some things, but it was still interesting. But it's a little bit more of a standard serial episode. The first 3 episodes are astounding because they really dig deeply into this idea of the science fiction hard hitting, you have to answer some questions, you're responsible here, what are you going to do about this. It was really 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 good. So m- what I'm saying is the tenacity of continuing to be interested in a story oftentimes will pay off when we can let go of some of our preconceived notions and ideas and allow the story to just progress. Being able to see a story for the parts of it that will eventually make sense can be rewarding all by themselves. But sometimes we have to let go of nostalgia. Sometimes we have to let go of our expectations that we are thinking it's going to be one way when it's actually going to be another. I mean, in some ways, I sort of felt this way about Fantastic Beasts. It's so totally different than what I understood the Harry Potter universe to sort of have at its core. I'm not saying that it deviates from Harry Potter, but it doesn't feel to me like it's a Harry Potter story that keeps me interested and enthralled. And I had to sort of give up a little bit of my preconceived, well, this isn't the Harry Potter world that I want to see, and embrace it for what it was. This is different kinds of storytelling. This is a different level. It's on a different plane. It's not about uh the Hogwarts world. It doesn't have the same innocent quality to it, and therefore I have to bring something a little bit different to the table with it. Um Going back to my original premise, which is sort of understanding the trends in storyline pieces that are happening right now in our 2022-2023 storytelling. I obviously I'm really excited about a lot of the progressive stuff that's happening, the bigger inclusion cycles. These are great. But what I'm not happy about specifically have to do with how we all as audience and fandoms are relating to this material. Now, once again, I'm going to reiterate this. I am absolutely not saying that if something isn't good, that it shouldn't be called out for not being good. Technical aspects, overuse of certain tropes, the idea that if y'all can hear that, I'm so sorry. I am babysitting a puppy and she is absolutely upset that I am on a podcast. I think she just wants to let everybody know that she too loves storytelling. Um, so there are pieces that we can 100% call out, but then there are times when we have to let go of the idea that somehow we alone can tell stories that we can only tell stories in one direction. We can only tell the story of Robin Hood as one Robin Hood with one idea at its center. And obviously, that's not true. There are 1,000 Robin Hood stories where you have people that come in and, take from corporations or become, take from the rich and feed the poor, that are not named Robin Hood, but we know that it's a Robin Hood story. If we can let go of some of our preconceived notions, then I think that 2022-2023 could be really surprising in the level of storytelling that we get. Now, I'm going to end my program here by saying that we are about to come up against the end of what most groups have, most production companies have in queue, except for Netflix, which I think has a plethora of material that it can kind of keep falling back on. But most other groups are absolutely going to run out of content. And the content is about to get really super thin. And a lot of this has to do with the writer's strike, and a lot of this has to do with uh, the studios not coming to agreement on writing and AI, writing and residuals, writing and writers' room, junior writers. There's just a lot that needs to be unpacked here, but we're about to hit that threshold where the content is going to become thin. And I think, we need to kind of buckle up for that. Everything that was in production, well, I should say in post production, will probably get through post production. I know the new season of The Boys is ready to hit. I know that there's, like I said, Wheel of Time is ready. That was in post production for a while. Anything that is in the technical aspects of post production, yeah, they're going to be fine. But new production, if they're using unionized writers, yeah, we're going to start hitting these walls, and there's going to be less and less content available. This is going to definitely be a difficult time for people like me who love to deconstruct stories, see what's new, get new trends, see what's happening in the world of storytelling. When we have a break like this, which is kind of interesting, um, what we come back to may be something different than what we left. And I don't know how the pause in writing is going to affect the writers or affect the studios in terms of what they're willing to now put into the production queue, or how we're going to process what just happened. But I do think that it's going to leave its mark. There will be some indelible aspects of what just happened on our storytelling going forward. It's even the best writers' rooms, when they have pauses and breaks, the continuity of thinking, the continuity of ideas are necessarily changed because there was the break. New ideas come in, old ideas go out, society changes. Our zeitgeist is a constantly evolving and ever changing idea stream that just, if I mean it moves so fast. You just watch TikTok for a couple of days and you realize how fast things are moving. So I think that our 2022-2023 calendar, in terms of what's coming next, movies and TV and even in literature, is going to be a really interesting time. Literature is not dependent upon the WGA. So we will continue to get more stories ramped up and pumped out, I think, literature wise. But I think we should all pay attention to what the WGA is saying and be thinking as writers about what the demands and complaints and requests for that the WGA is giving, because they affect everyone altogether. What are the impacts of AI on writing? What if AI writes a book? Who gets the credit? Who gets the monetization? What if we create inside of a world where we come up with the main and central ideas, but then those main and central ideas are farmed out to little writers' rooms where we're paying people cents on the dollar in comparison, and then they have to do all the heavy lifting, but the people that came up with the idea get practically nothing. These are all sort of ideas that I think that as writers we can find solidarity in. I'm not saying that everybody has to go on strike. I am saying that there are ideas in the WGA, uh, in what the complaint is with studios and with producers, that I think we should all really stop and take a look at. Whether they affect us today or down the road, they will affect us. AI is going to be a significant portion of our talking points going forward, and how we handle that is going to be very significant moving forward. What does AI do with mythology? How does AI understand or parse the human condition? What are we looking at in terms of how AI represents racism in literature? And then on top of that, again, just the economic questions that I think we need to ask. So it is definitely going to be a very interesting year coming up and going forward, one with which we should be asking the really hard questions, the questions that we get in our high fantasy series, in our, big looming morality plays, in our everyday dramas that are trying to say, hey, there are questions out here. We need to get them answered. Let's think about them. Give us a fictional setting, put us there. We'll be the protagonists. We'll understand the world, and then we'll experience those questions within those parameters. It's a safe place to parse whether or not we like AI or don't like AI. How are we going to reconcile with it? We put ourselves in a safe place to understand a fictionalized world full of racists, in a fictionalized world full of bigotry, in a fictionalized world full of good intentions but fascist ideas. Like, when we put ourselves in these fictional places, we can parse and really get to the hard hitting questions that we all need to answer as writers, as content creators, as just viewers of good story. With that, I will say that first of all, thank you for joining me tonight. Secondly, I'm really sad that my producer Josh couldn't be here. Apparently, he was having some technical issues, but I will invite him back next week because I do have some new things to talk about movie wise. And I think getting his perspective on some things may be interesting. I am going to talk about TCM. That's kind of a big one, and the preservation of old movies and what that means to storytelling going forward, why it's important, what is happening right now, why there is sort of this back and forth, and what, as writers, some of these older movies that are based on all kinds of different ideas, why it would matter to us today. What is happening to the archive world, let's say, of fiction 60 plus years ago? It does matter. It matters for what 60 years from now people will be saying about your work and what you're doing and how you're creating, and then what that archive may mean to future generations. So please join me for that. And I hope you have a wonderful rest of your week. I hope that you find something very interesting to read. I hope you find something very interesting to entertain you. Keep telling stories. That's the heart of it all. Keep telling stories. Thank you so much for joining me. Have a wonderful night. Bye.
We named the dog Indiana.